Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah. So welcome everybody. You'll see that people are still joining the meeting. Welcome to this second, although it's probably the 6th or 7th workshop and webinar that we've done from the National Consortium of Societal Resilience. Absolutely delighted to have Carolyn Otley from Cumbria CVS join us, with Mike Park, who's from Mountain Rescue from England and Wales. And many of you will know Carolyn very well, and all the work that they've been doing in Cumbria around societal resilience. It's really been inspiring across the country. Some of you will never have heard of the work that has been going on in Cumbria because you're from overseas and you're joining us from the first time. So the consortium has been working for the last year in the UK around societal resilience. And we thought that because we have been sharing these webinars internationally for the first time, we thought we would do a very quick introduction to what the webinar, to what the consortium is, and just a little bit of background as to some of the work that's been going on. First, I should say that my name is Duncan Shaw. I work at the University of Manchester. And with me today is Andrew McClelland, he's going to be running the Q&A session that follows on from Cumbria's talk. But what we'll do is give a very brief introduction to NCSR and then hand over to Caroline and Mike. They will provide a talk for a period of time, 30-40 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A time, and you'll have the opportunity to come off camera, come off mute, ask your question, use the chat function, and interact with the speakers today. So the NCSR is a consortium that was established in response to the integrated review that was done in the UK, and it called for whole of society resilience. It called for looking at community resilience slightly differently and thinking about how can we involve everybody in building resilience across our communities. So the consortium was established, and we currently include local government and the LRFs, the emergency planning groups, the LPGs, from across the whole of the UK, plus including Guernsey, Jersey and the Isle of Man. So we also include important sector partners from the voluntary sector, business, government, and then the University of Manchester. And what we're trying to do is further the conversation around societal resilience, provide toolkits, provide information that can help local government, that can help resilience partners to take a step forward in societal resilience. We're doing that through a number of different ways. Developing an ecosystem, and in part that's these sort of events, webinars and sharing information, about learning together, about strengthening relationships and identifying what lessons we can share across the UK and across the world. We're developing consistent materials that provide resilience partnerships with information about how do you establish and how do you implement societal resilience, and then sharing that where possible. So we'll be developing a whole series of different materials that we'll be sharing within and beyond the consortium. We are running webinars. This is obviously one that you're attending today, and everybody's most welcome. And we'll be running a future webinar looking at the work of West Sussex, and that will be on the 6th of December. And we'll be sharing very soon information on how to sign up for that. We're also going to be running a national conference that will be in Manchester, so a physical in-person conference for a change on the 21st of March. And I'm hoping that one of the team can share some of the web links so that you're able to access that conference if you would like to come. You're also able to get in touch with the consortium and look at past webinars and so forth. You can Google NCSR Plus website, LinkedIn's all on the sheet there, and you're welcome to get in touch. You're welcome to view some of the videos from the launch from USA, Canada, Japan, and various other places that have done webinars for us. So without any further introduction, I'd like to welcome Caroline and Mike. I'd like to hand over, so I'm going to stop sharing screen now. I'd like to welcome them and thank them very much in advance for the presentation. As I say, the work that's been going on in Cumbria has been really interesting and groundbreaking. So, Caroline, I wonder if you'd like to just maybe start sharing your screen. I can see that being shared, and then we can just do a sound check, please.
Yep, can you hear us, Duncan?
Yeah, it's perfect. It's coming through very clearly.
Fabulous. So I think I'll do some brief introductions. As Duncan said, I'm Carolyn Otley. I'm the Community Resilience Coordinator for Cumbria, employed by Cumbria CVS, a local charity, but I work across all the partners of Cumbria Local Resilience Forum. And sat next to me is Mike Park from Mountain Rescue. I think that the clue and the common thread is that we're both sat here today in the Cockermouth Mountain Rescue Team base, and that's how we've known each other for many years. Mike will do himself a bit more of an introduction when we get on. So what we're planning to cover today is a bit of Cumbria LRF's Communities to Cobra approach, but a couple of parts to that. I think we'll start off with Mike talking about how Cumbria LRF has worked with specialised voluntary sector organisations like Mountain Rescue, and then how we've shifted that into working with lots of informal community groups and that kind of whole of societal resilience piece. We'll talk about that a little bit as the different layers that there are within societal resilience. And then we'll try and pull out our thoughts on what's made it work. So hopefully that's largely what people are expecting, and we'll jump on in. So we'll start off with the slide we usually start off with where's Cumbria, because lots of people haven't necessarily heard of it. And I think the answer's in the kind of the top left of those pinky orange blobs. Cumbria's up in the north of England on the west coast, just below the Scottish border. So we're not in Scotland, although we often have to explain to people that that's actually the case. But I think that people don't necessarily realise is that other blob down in the bottom right, which if I enlarge it, is what Cumbria looks like if you superimpose it over London. So Cumbria covers a huge geographical area, the all of central London, and a lot of those surrounding counties. But a lot of the middle of Cumbria looks very much like this. So the middle of the county is filled with mountains, which makes it pretty challenging to travel around at the best of times, but particularly difficult to travel around in the middle of an incident like a flood event or severe weather. So a really quick run through what local resilience forums are, because I think we've got a few people on the call from outside the UK who won't necessarily be familiar with the structure. So Cumbria Local Resilience Forum was formed in 2005 as a result of the Civil Contingencies Act in 2004. And it brings together a range of organisations from across the county to plan and prepare for different emergencies. Local resilience forums are based on police force areas. And so for us, that's Cumbria. There are in legislation, Category 1 responders, including the emergency services and local authorities, who have one set of responsibilities. There are Category 2 responders, companies like the utility companies, who have a different set of responsibilities. And then there are a huge range of other organisations involved, and that, I guess, is Cumbria's Communities to Cobra approach. So couldn't possibly fit everybody's logos on there, but you can see it in that kind of list of logos of the organisations involved in Cumbria's Local Resilience Forum. We've got those Category 1 responders, the police, the emergency services, the Environment Agency. We've got some of the Category 2 responders like United Utilities, but we've also got some of our big employers who are required to have emergency plans, and third sector organisations like Salvation Army and Red Cross. And I think one of the reasons Cumbria LRF has been working with a wide range of voluntary and community sector organisations over the years is that you've seen those photographs of the middle of Cumbria. There are parts of Cumbria and lots of emergencies that can't be dealt with by the standard emergency services. So this is a slide I nicked off Andy Slattery, who was our LRF chair and chaired the SCGs through the COVID response, who described the voluntary sector in Cumbria as the 4th, 5th, 6th and 7th emergency services, with organisations like the RNLI and Mines Rescue being a key part of kind of day-to-day work for many of the partners at the within the Local Resilience Forum. And then from working with those formal voluntary sector organisations, we've shifted very much into working with the wider voluntary sector, so people like community transport volunteers and our communities themselves. So I think that is probably pretty much the summary of the Communities to COBRA approach, and we'll cover some bits of that in more detail. I think the other myth we want to bust from the start is the idea that just because Cumbria is filled with mountains and it sometimes feels like there are more sheep than people, people might think it'll never happen in Cumbria. But photographs there showing the range of major incidents that the Local Resilience Forum has dealt with over the years, including things like major travel incidents, train crashes, coach cab crashes, flooding and a mass shooting. But I think a lot of the focus of our talk and a lot of the times that we've kind of pushed forwards the Communities to COBRA approach has been in floods, because Cumbria has certainly seen more than its fair share of floods. I think that's probably where I first hand it over to you, isn't it, Mike?
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Park. I'm the CEO of Mountain Rescue England and Wales. But this slide is, for me, the start of both of our personal involvement with LRFs, and this is going back to 2009 in the town that we live in, Cockermouth, and at the time I was the team leader of Cockermouth team, and this is the site that I was greeted with literally one day in November back in 2009, and we were really, apart from literally being thrown in the deep end of the water in the street, I think a lot of us were suddenly thrown in the deep end of the involvement with LRFs and major incidents. So to give you, thanks Carolyn, so to give you a little bit of background about what Mountain Rescue is, Mountain Rescue is literally, as it says on the tin, we're a group of volunteers in individual teams, 47 teams across both England and Wales. Up here in Cumbria, there's 10 teams in the whole of the Lake District, or Cumbria as we're seeing it. And of them individual teams, normally we have around 40 team members. And we literally do what it says on the tin. We go and take people off the hills and the mountains around Cumbria. Okay. We're all independent charities, 450 unpaid professional volunteers, no paid staff. And in the bigger picture with regards to the region, we're part of Mountain Rescue England Wales, which, as I say, makes up 8 regions and 47 teams, around 3,500 people across the country. So our role is to rescue people and animals lost or injured in the mountains. Sorry. For the day-to-day tasking, we're normally tasked by the police, and in this case Cumbria Police, but we can be brought on board by the other emergency services such as the ambulance service. In Cumbria we average 650 call-outs per year, and them call-outs can, on a normal call-out, last between 4 or 5 hours, but they could last a couple of days, or even in the extreme be a couple of weeks. One we wanted to touch on was technology in mountain rescue, and these specific 3 that we're highlighting on this slide. SARCall is a mountain rescue built software, which is a command and control command and control system that allows us to work with the team, other teams, and the individual team members, but also with the other emergency services. And it's literally a log that allows us to control and manage a situation. And this is unique, I would suggest, in that I don't believe a system like that still yet exists in the country. We've talked about it, but it doesn't actually exist across the emergency services as yet. The other item we've shown there was MR Map. So all our individual team members are carrying a GPS device within their phones and within the radios. So at any time we've got live tracking of our individual members wherever they are on the hill, and that includes every team member across the country, which again, from a safety perspective and a management of an incident perspective, means that we have live tracking of all of our assets and all of the partner assets that are coming in to deal with the rescue. And then finally, the last one on that slide is SARLOC and phone find. The majority of our call outs are for individuals that are either lost or injured or found themselves in the problem in the remote area of Cumbria. And one of the issues we've had over a number of years is trying to locate these people, or for these people to actually know where they are. And this has certainly come home to roost during and after COVID, where we've had a lot of new adventurers and new people coming to explore the outdoors. So what SARLOC phone find allows us to do is, normally the way that we're alerted that there's a call out in the first place is there is a phone signal, so an individual will phone up and say, I have a problem. They will do that through the 999 service to the police. Once the police have alerted us, we will contact the individual by text, and what we do is we send an app through text to that phone, which enables that phone to be opened up and reveal the location to the individual and ourselves. So it means that we can find people a lot easier. The main point we're getting to here is this is pretty groundbreaking technology. It certainly was groundbreaking technology when we introduced it, and it's been brought in from within Mountain Rescue itself. Okay, so Mountain Rescue teams in Cumbria LRF. So 2009, the floods were a trigger for the Lake District Mountain Rescue team's involvement in Cumbria LRF. It was a major incident that lasted for 10 days. It was certainly 6 days in the response period, and then went on for a good deal longer in the recovery phase. And Mountain Rescue was very much involved from day one, literally the first hour of that incident. And our role is to deal with internal major incidents. That's incidents between teams where one team is unable to manage a situation on themselves, and external major incidents such as with our LRF partners. Resulting from this and from doing this in 2009, where Mountain Rescue is involved with the involvement with Cumbria LRF, is a closer working relationship with the LRF partners, and that's also the adoption of common working practices such as JESIP and training and common training such as tactical emergency management and the magic course. And then But further to that, where we've developed from 2009, is that we are now running internally major incident exercises and involving ourselves with our partners in external major incident exercises. So, what does Mountain Rescue offer to Cumbria LRF? Well, it means that we have an ability to get to more difficult locations within Cumbria. We work with an independent radio communication system that works across Cumbria and in more of the remoter areas where some of the other emergency services networks may not work. And we've also got access onto airwaves, which is the common emergency radio communications across Cumbria. It also means by having an independent radio communication system is that when one of the other services goes down or ours goes down, we can rely on a partner organisation. As it says, we are a mountain rescue team. We're not flood rescue. We're not the RNLI. But what we found certainly in Cumbria was there was a lack of capability with regards to flood rescue. So it was something that we adopted within Mountain Rescue in Cumbria in the early 2000s, and we continue to do that today. So what that means within Cumbria and 450 members of Mountain Rescue in Cumbria, 120 of them are swiftwater rescue technicians and 13 water incident managers within the region. And how we deal with flooding in Cumbria with regards to from a mountain rescue perspective is we're not working as 10, 12 individual teams. We're working as one individual team and calling on all of that resource. The other thing that Mountain Rescue offers is medical support. We've down there's casualty care certificate. So majority of our team members are casualty care trained, which is similar to the qualifications you'd find with regards to an ambulance technician. And then one of the more important ones within Cumbria is we tend to be the emergency service that has the most experience of working and communicating with helicopters, both search and rescue helicopters and air ambulances. And because of the nature of mountain rescue, we do seem to get called on with regards to our mapping skills, and we seem to be involved with a lot of the RD mapping for ourselves and also for other emergency services. Then back in 2015, following on from 2009, we had a bigger major incident, which was Storm Desmond, which came and affected literally the whole of Cumbria and then into the whole of the northwest of England. And I guess that's where, as teams, we moved even further outside our regions and more involved the whole of Mountain Rescue England Wales and that mountain rescue community. So we had shared resources come from outside of Cumbria in to help with the incident in Cumbria, and then as the incident developed further across north of England, we found ourselves then moving into other parts of northern England, and the teams from the south of the country were coming up to be involved. And the facts are there written on the slide. Then in 2018, we had the beast from the east came in. So suddenly we were taken back out of the water and I guess back into a bit more of our normal environment, which was really the logistics and the moving around on ground with obviously some severe weather and snow there. And the support there we were given certainly was spread across more of the LRF partners. And finally to 2020, and you could say, what's Mountain Rescue got to do with pandemic? And well, the pandemic was affecting us as individuals. We still had a role to do in that people were still walking out on the hills, and we still needed to go out and rescue them. But then we also had to look at the logistics of, have we got team members available? How do we stop the spread of the pandemic within the teams? How do we deal with individuals and be part of the solution and not of the cause? And then down to even to the point of, as soon as the lockdowns came, were opened up, everybody was suddenly trying to get back out into the countryside, and there was a mass movement, certainly into the Lake District, of obviously a lot more people, but also a different type of people coming into the lakes. And we've had to get involved in making sure that we were communicating and communicating the same message with the LRF partners to make sure that people were invited back into the Lake District, but obviously were being safe. So beyond Cumbria, and just to give you a bit of background, beyond Cumbria and the 10 teams in the Lake District, we have 8 regions across England and Wales, 49 teams. The role of Mountain Rescue England and Wales is a national representative body, and like I say, I'm now have the dubious pleasure of heading that up. Our role is to link into national government, UKSAR, and be the voice of the 49 teams across the country. Outside of England and Wales, we have a further 25 teams up in Scotland, and a further 11 teams in Ireland. And there is a point on that slide regards to links into local resilience forums. Certainly, I know within Cumbria, from our own personal experience, is that we feel that we have a really strong working relationship and a working partnership with Cumbria LRF. I can't say that that's necessarily the case across the country, but it's something that we would want to encourage.
Okay, and I think that's back to me. Let me just move in and jiggle things a little. Right, okay, so I think that is kind of the start of Cumbria LRF's Communities to COBRA approach, working with the more formal and the more organised voluntary sector organisations. My involvement in the LRF, as Mike said, also started with the floods. I had a little involvement in 2009, but most of my involvement was in 2015, where I wasn't stood in the middle of the high street like that, but I was over in police headquarters trying to tie together the 2 different logging systems through the start of the storm. However, I think most of my involvement in the flooding caused by Storm Desmond was in the community recovery work that took place afterwards. So for the 6 months after that flooding, I was very heavily involved in the recovery coordination on connecting our local voluntary sector organisations and community groups into that community recovery work. Following on from Storm Desmond, in the voluntary sector in Cumbria, we had a big programme called Rebuilding Together that was a lottery funded programme that was working to increase the resilience of Cumbrian communities to severe weather events. I'll run really quickly through some of the activities we did in that because I think it demonstrates some of those layers of societal resilience. So we did work with individual households about how they might prepare for an emergency. We did work with community groups of various kinds, including encouraging communities to write emergency plans, of which we have about 40 emergency plans stored on Resilience Direct. And we encouraged some of our third sector organisations, so groups like Citizens Advice, who are critical in the aftermath of a major incident, to think about their own business continuity. We did some training of volunteers and did some work around the liability insurance for those volunteers. But then at kind of a system level, we did a lot of work around making sure that groups could feed into the incident debriefs of those incidents and give their experience of what it had been like to help us as an LRF to do better the next time. I think, like today, we've done a lot of work sharing what we've learned and what's worked and what hasn't with other areas. So I think in many ways for me, all of that comes together in things like this community exercise that Keswick ran in 2019. This was an emergency planning exercise run by the community group in Keswick, primarily to kind of test and exercise their plans with their volunteers up in that top right photograph. But they invited other LRF partners along to take part in that exercise. So you can see that the police and county council up in the top left-hand corners. You can see my kids happily volunteering to test the reception centre by going into the unaccompanied children and check the staff could cope with that. And you can see down in the right, the postcard that was put by those volunteers through every house in the flood zone, encouraging people to sign up for flood warnings and test their flood defences at a property level. But I guess where we got to through that project was loads of good stuff going on, it all joining up in some places, joining up really well, but a need to still mind the gap. And that gap, I think, was we began to realise there was much more to community resilience than just community emergency planning. And a couple of incidents that really pushed this home to us were some flooding in Millom in 2018. Millom didn't have a community emergency plan, but what it did have was a really strong community network that had been set up to campaign against the closure of NHS services. And the community in Millom used that network, used its Facebook group, and that Facebook group has nearly as many members as there are residents in Millom, so its reach is really good to coordinate that response to and recovery from the flooding. And then similarly in Beast from the East, towards the end of 2018, Alston in the Pennines was cut off for about 9 days in total in the areas just beyond. And we were very much reliant not only on the formal voluntary sector, so you can see Baysar there on the left, but also the community itself, organising itself spontaneously and going out and helping local residents. And that's where my community resilience coordinator role came from. I think retrospectively, I've started describing it as emergency planning meets community development. And I guess in there, two very different approaches to things. The emergency services can be very used to working in a command and control kind of way, whereas community development is very much about doing what communities want to and working around the flexibility of doing things in the way that works best for a particular community. And so my role has been very much trying to make sense of the mess in the middle, where two very different cultures meet each other, sometimes with fairly dramatic clashes. And I think one element that's come out of that has been the concept of being comfortable with chaos, making people comfortable with the fact that communities don't necessarily all want to write an emergency plan. It would probably be much easier for us as an LRF if they did. But becoming more comfortable with working with communities as they are. And I guess that the point of this is my role had a number of parts to it. It was partly about improving the systems and making sure we wrote communities and voluntary sector organisations into the LRF plans. But it was, and partly about working with communities so that they understood those structures and those plans better. But it was also very much about working with our statutory sector partners, making them more comfortable with chaos, and getting over this quote, which came from one of our local authority managers, that working in this way was scary and it felt like they were breaking all the rules. At which point it's time for the coronavirus update. I'd be doing the community resilience coordinator role for about a year before the pandemic hit. But I think it laid the groundwork really well for a major incident in which we saw a huge response from communities with mutual aid groups formed across the county. So very early on in Cumbria LRF, we decided to actively take an approach that encouraged that support to take place at the lowest level possible, to put in place the structures that allowed individuals and households to support themselves. So making sure people knew which of the local shops were taking telephone orders and delivering food, encouraging people to check on friends and family and neighbours, and only for the people who couldn't kind of get help in those informal ways, putting them in touch with more formal support groups. And then the idea being the more support people could find for themselves or find very locally, the less that we'd have to do as a local resilience forum in terms of delivering food parcels and getting people into formal NHS and social care services. We did work really closely with the county council here. They had a centralised helpline, they had welfare hubs, and they were in a position where they could deliver food out to people who needed it. But I think what we found was people tended to phone the helpline once, find out about their local support groups, and then organise their own support locally. So coordinating all of that was a bit of a mammoth effort. I chaired a community resilience subgroup, which fed into our strategic coordinating group. But then we had 6 local community resilience coordinating groups chaired by local authority council staff and a network of community groups below each of those. Huge range of organisations involved in that community resilience structure, very similar group of organisations to the first slide showing LRF partners, perhaps with the addition there of our local enterprise partnership, linking in the business work, business sector into some of that community resilience work. I think we had a really big push as an LRF about getting partners to promote people to take community action, to look after their neighbours. And one of the big findings from that was the feedback there in the green bubble, that lots of people felt they needed to be given permission by the council, by the police, to go and ask their neighbour if they needed help. I think a lot of people have got themselves into the mindset that that kind of thing had to be done by social care. And at the end of this, we ended up with about 300 new community groups connected into the coronavirus coordination structures. Lots of my time in that early bit of the pandemic was spent getting information out to groups, and I think supporting them to be able to go about doing that work reasonably well, and having the information they needed to do that. I think I knew it was working when those photographs in the middle started appearing on Twitter, and the information we were sending out was appearing on parish council notice boards around the county. But our link into the SCG was also really important, because it meant that when we went into that first lockdown, we were very quickly able to work with Cumbria Police to put together the letter on the right, explaining to people what they could and couldn't do in terms of helping their neighbours and shopping for others during the lockdowns, which certainly provided a lot of reassurance to those community volunteers. So I think all in all, reasonably well. Obviously some hiccups in there that we haven't got time to go into the detail of, but another big step forwards in that communities to COBRA approach. So I think this is where we are almost at the end, and we might have a little bit of a double act on this last slide. What do we think has made it work? So I think Cumbria has a pretty strong sense of place, but in terms of tying it all together, many of the boundaries line up in Cumbria, not all of them, but certainly from the perspective of the mountain rescue teams joining up with the police footprint and a single local resilience forum, that's made it much, much easier for the mountain rescue teams to connect into the LRF than is perhaps the case in some other parts of the country. But I think we all kind of agree that finding the right people and making friends before you need them has been absolutely key. it's been really important to have the support there at a strategic level in the LRF to give permission to work in this way. But it's also been really important to use the community staff who aren't necessarily the staff who'd normally be involved in an LRF response, but who are working for those organisations that are LRF partners, and then working with the community leaders, the councillors, the community activists out in those communities who'll bring the rest of the community along with them. I think there's definitely a case of being brave. As I've said, doing things differently feels scary. And I think that's something Mike and Mountain Rescue come across as well. And I think certainly going into the pandemic, I was pitching very strongly that, yes, it feels scary, but there are risks to not doing things differently as well. So we need to balance those two risks and give it a go. I think one thing that's really clear is there's been quite a lot of financial investment in Cumbria in developing that community infrastructure and supporting small community groups. So little community mutual aid groups don't necessarily need lots of funding as a group. They're a group of volunteers, but they do often need the support, the help, the advice, the friendly ear to get it going, and to be brave and to know that it's okay to do what we're asking them to do. But I think probably the biggest one for both of us is this investing in building the skills and building the relationships and creating, I guess, and these were your words, weren't they, Mike, a proper partnership where it's possible to say no as well as to say yes. So I don't...
Totally. That's literally for me the advice I got from I think it was Assistant Chief Constable at the time was you need to tell us if we're asking you guys too much, and that to me sums it up. It's partnerships about being able to say no, we can't do that, and not feeling that you're upsetting somebody.
So I think to end, we'll go back to the picture you've seen a number of times, but the idea that key to all of this is to make friends before you need them. And with that, and as I try and take my screen down and stop sharing, we'll hand over back to you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn and Mike. That was fascinating and extremely well illustrated presentation. It was great to be able to follow the narrative also through all of the wonderful photographs and other visual material that you presented. We do have a number of questions already in the chat function. Some of the early ones, which I suspect are related to some of what Mike was talking about in terms of the technology. And I just wonder, just to give maybe Steph and also Jamie a bit of a heads up, that if they would be willing to perhaps pose their questions on camera, then we have several relating to Sarlock, if that's the correct pronunciation, but also then in relation to the East of England Ambulance Service and a different package which they're using. So if Steph or Jamie are willing to come on screen, then you can ask the questions directly. So I'm looking for... Hi, Jamie. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks. So, as you said, more than a question, it was just to raise awareness. It's a system that we've started utilising within East of England Ambulance Service, and certainly been used by other emergency service partners as well. Airbox systems, which I know other SAR teams have looked at. They've got a sister piece of software that all HEMS aircraft should navigate with. So the mountain rescue teams may already be aware of it. It was just to raise awareness. It covers a lot of that functionality about location data from mobile phones, login, mapping, that sort of thing. Thanks.
And Steph, I see you also had a point or a query in relation to the Sarlock in particular.
Hi, yeah, sorry, I don't even know if my camera is working.
It is, yes, it is.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, so there's been a lot of promotion of using what 3 words. So I was wondering how that contradicted the use of the SARLOC system, and which one we should be advocating for the public to be using.
Right, okay, so 2 different systems, Steph. What 3 words or any navigation system that's out there is obviously going to be extremely useful to the individuals. SARLOC is different in that if I take it as you didn't realise that you had the ability to locate yourself on your phone, what this text does is the text comes to, I send the text to you, you just accept the text goes into the inner workings of your phone, reveals to you where you are, but it also tells me back in wherever, this is where Steph is. And then I can walk to you rather than you having to find your way off the hill.
That's brilliant, thank you. I'm assuming it doesn't need Wi-Fi or anything like that then?
No, it works with a mobile phone signal, so it's relying on being able to send a text and the fact that your phone has a GPS function, but most phones do have that now.
Brilliant.
And I guess the other bit we found, Steph, is that it's much easier to see what the error is when we get a SARLOC or a phone find back. It will tell us plus or minus 20 metres. The challenge is sometimes it says plus or minus 2 kilometres, which if we know it is great, but when we get a what 3 words back, we don't tend to know whether the error's 2 metres or 2 kilometres.
That's great. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much. So I have a number of people with hands up. So before I come to David Mitchell in relation to one of the questions in the chat, could I perhaps ask Claire, who has a hand up, to perhaps pose the question? Or
sorry, it's Stephen. My wife and I share a Zoom. She's a minister, so she's got the first dibs on the name. So Stephen Maxwell. I'm work for NHS England London region. Both my sides of my family are from West Cumbria, so it's really nice to hear some Cumbrian accents, and I appreciate that. So having a bit of family background in Cumbria, I'm aware that the county as a whole is one of the older demographically counties in the country, and also there's a lot of low income families, as well as a lot of poverty. I mean, my dad's from Cleator, so you'll know about that as well. So I'm really just wondering if there's any special considerations you had to make in your outreach to these communities, or if there's been any special challenges around that as well.
So I think a couple of bits, Stephen. I think that the issue around some of our communities, and particularly some of our tiny rural communities, having very much an older population, has certainly come up when we've been talking to communities about writing an emergency plan. There've been communities that have gone, well, you know, we're all 70 now. If it floods in 10 years' time, we're not going to be able to take furniture upstairs. I think the best solution we've come up with there is around working with some of the local sports clubs in terms of, can their volunteers get involved and help out, and helping communities to make those links into organisations. I guess there've been some other challenges around how willing people are to use technology as well, and things like getting text messages through around flood warnings. And I guess in that perspective, one of the key messages we push on in the comms very early on in an incident is look after yourself first, definitely, but do check your neighbours are aware of what's going on, because it's obviously quicker for somebody to go and knock on the houses each side of them than it is to get police officers out on the street knocking doors. In terms of the low income families, yeah, I mean, it was interesting as we went into lockdown that the spread of mutual aid groups wasn't even across the country, and we did have a bit of a gap in some of those more deprived communities in West Cumbria. One of the things we did there was get Sellafield as a big local employer who had lots of staff who weren't able to go into work to work. They encouraged some of their staff to effectively set up those mutual aid groups in towns like Whitehaven. So a slightly different approach to it, but working with those big employers to try and fill those gaps and make it a bit more even. So I don't think any magic answers, but some bits we've tried as we've gone along.
No, some really good tips. Thanks very much.
And if David Mitchell is willing to either pose a question or to come on camera relating to question in the chat function. And after David, I think we would move to Martin Funnell. So David, if you're willing.
Andrew, thank you. Yes, I'm willing, but I don't have a camera, so can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Okay, yeah. I'm David Mitchell. I'm a local authority emergency planning manager, and in Merseyside Resilience Forum, I've got the management responsibility for the groups that cover all aspects of people and communities in response and recovery. One of the challenges we have in a county like Merseyside is lack of risk awareness, or people that aren't the risks there for people to focus on, to give them an interest in engaging in community resilience. And there's also, while the community identity associated with the City of Liverpool is internationally known, at a more local level, there isn't that sense of community identity for small areas that I think applies in somewhere like Cumbria. But obviously in Cumbria you've got contrasting areas with the urban and the more rural areas. So based on the experience you've had, would you have any observations to make on how the approach you've used in Cumbria could be applied in an urban environment where there isn't that clear identity and where there isn't the awareness of or desire to engage with risks, please?
Yeah, so I don't know that we'll come up with any real answers, David, but I guess the area that has always challenged us most in Cumbria is Carlisle, which is our most urban area. It's not huge by your standards. It's got a population of about 100,000 people. But I think because so a few things, it's flooded a number of times in Carlisle. So you would think that awareness of the flood risk was fairly high. But the reality is that people don't want to live in an area that floods repeatedly. So in those flood risk areas, a lot of the properties have shifted to being private rented accommodation. And there's a really high turnover of tenants in those some of the times. So that is an area that has kind of faced those issues. And despite the first big floods I remember in Carlisle were 2005, over 15 years, we haven't really been able to get community-led emergency planning up and running in Carlisle. I think what was interesting was we did see a really strong community-led response to the pandemic in Carlisle. A lot of that was organised through the local Labour Party. And what we started at the moment, initially through some funding from the public health team, so COVID funding, was to see what we can do to connect to those groups that started off in response to the pandemic, to see whether they've got any interest in effectively pivoting their work to think about other kinds of emergency planning. We've made a bit of headway there, but it's very much in the early stages. I guess the other bit it's worth saying is that the communities where there is the strongest community-led emergency response tend to be our kind of market towns, so Cockermouth, Keswick, Appleby, that have flooded repeatedly. So they're kind of places with a population of maybe 8,000 to 10,000 people. But even at that size of town, to keep it going on a long-term basis, they've tended to end up with a paid coordinator working perhaps one day a week. So the model we're looking at in Carlisle is to try and find a community group who are willing to employ a coordinator for a day or two a week to push that work forward. So to keep that community lead on it, but to give them a bit of resource to do it with. And for Carlisle, we've got funding for the next 5 years for that through an Environment Agency DEFRA innovation programme. So maybe we'll come back with the answer in 5 years' time.
Well,
thanks. That's all really helpful. Thank you.
So we'll go to Martin Funnell next, and after, if Matt Hogan can perhaps ready himself to ask a question in relation to bravery from public sector stakeholders. So Martin, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Carolyn and Mike. What brilliant presentation, and such a lovely part of the world you got up there. Thank you. A couple of questions, if I may. One that you mentioned in your slides was about public liability insurance. I know it's always been a question often at the back of people's minds, even if it's not a showstopper in launching community resilience. But you said about working with Neighbourhood Watch. Obviously, they're a national organisation. Are you able to share a little bit more with that, or is it something that we could chat about at another time?
Yeah, I think that is definitely something we can dig out the information for and get circulated and get to you, Martin. So yeah, liability has been a big issue. The Neighbourhood Watch liability insurance is quite limited. It's that public liability side of things. I think the challenge we've always come up against in Cumbria is that we can insure groups and volunteers through people like the local authority if they're being directly tasked, but we don't want to be in a position as an LRF where we're actively tasking every individual group, because it works just fine when we've got one community flooding. It doesn't work very well when we've got the whole of Cumbria flooding and 50 groups to phone up because nobody's got the time to do it. So yeah, absolutely. And lots more insurance issues that we're still working through with some of those groups around what insurers will and won't cover them to do. So probably easier to pick it up as a conversation offline, I imagine. We can dig that out and get the information to you.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And the other question is opposite end of the spectrum, really. Have you done anything specifically with younger people in developing community resilience through schools or youth organisations?
We've done little bits, I think. So we did some with young people as part of that project after Storm Desmond, almost more as part of the recovery work, working in some of the local schools to, and this was secondary schools, to put together a performance where they would do kind of live play of a run of a flood incident as it might happen normally, get suggestions from the audience who were people who were flooded about how they'd improve it, and then do a kind of live rerun of their performance, building in those suggestions. But that was really about building awareness in the wider community of that flood risk and preparedness activity. The other little bit of stuff we did, which is still on the list of things to spread out, but it got a bit put on hold by the pandemic, was to work through people like mini police. So Cumbria has a mini police scheme in primary schools, and we did, before the pandemic, a number of trips into primary schools to talk to their mini police groups about really basic household emergency planning. So the kind of, I think we've simplified the household emergency planning as we've been through things. We kind of started with a 2 sides of A4 plan to write everything down on. But for a lot of audiences, we've kind of reverted back to the, if you had to leave your home, what would it be important to take with you? And if you got stuck in your home for 2 or 3 days, not able to go out, what would you need to have with you at home? So more in the little bits than any organised approach at the moment.
Well, thank you.
Lovely, thank you very much. Carolyn. Look forward to chatting. Thank you. So
if Matt Hogan is able to ask a question from the chat function, and just before he does so, for those that are asking in terms of the recordings, that will be made available after, so you will be able to enjoy again the presentation. Go ahead, Matt.
31. Thank you. It's great to hear from you both. It's fantastic work. My question follows on from the 2 previous ones, really, around what struck me was this is a bit of a careful dance between the community and then the stakeholders that support them. And your comment around sort of bravery. I just wondered if you'd picked up any sort of other barriers to bravery. So we've obviously talked about the sort of liabilities, the insurance aspects, training I think was mentioned as well, but whether there's any other barriers to bravery that you picked up, and any sort of top tips on navigating those.
That might be one we go away and think about and get back to you, I think, Matt. I mean, I think one of the key bits for navigating it, probably both for mountain rescue and for the wider work, has been having that support at a strategic level, and somebody who can give permission to their own organisation to give it a go and take those risks. Certainly going into the pandemic and thinking about how do we work with those mutual aid groups, I knew that most of the risk wasn't going to sit with me as the subgroup chair. It was going to sit with our county council, who had a lot of the statutory responsibility. And I was really grateful when I got an email at 6 o'clock one morning from the director I'd worked with in flood recovery 5 years before, which said, we might be working together again, because my response was good. I've got 4 things I need you to sign off, because I need to know what your risk appetite is as an organisation before I push this any further. Anything you want to add, Mike?
I think it really goes back to that slide, Matt, of make friends in peacetime. It's a lot easier for established LRF partners to be braver when they've met the individuals that you now want to be involved with these incidents, to do that in peacetime. And also, the more and more individuals that we get to meet across it's easier to make that group decision than an individual one commander. Am I going to trust this mountain rescue team to go and look after that part of my incident? It's a lot easier to do that when you know somebody than it is to suddenly meet somebody with just a badge on at that time. So do it in peacetime and make lots of friends.
And I guess, yeah, he's reminded me, it's always good to have him here. I mean, I guess one of the big bits of my job pre-COVID was that kind of pushing LRF partners every time, that when you run a training course, can you open that up to the community groups? When you run an exercise, can we involve the local community group in that? And if we can't, can we at least stick some community-based injects into that to get people thinking about how they do it? But probably particularly the incident debriefs of how do you involve the community in that debrief, because you were only doing the response to help those people. So you need to hear their perspective. I think we've got Hugh Deeming on the call. Hugh dragged me into the recovery debrief after Storm Desmond, and I think we had a debrief with probably 100, 120 people in it, half of whom were voluntary and community sector for that, which was quite an experience all round.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Matt, for your question. So we have in the chat function an excellent question from Maddie Adams in relation to evaluating the resilience of communities. But before we come to that, we have an earlier question, and from Nazarene, who also has a hand up, and I apologize in advance for my name pronunciation. So if you could unmute and pose the question from the chat function, thank you.
Sure, thank you so much. It's a wonderful session today, and I'm really privileged, and greetings to every one of you from Chennai in India. My question is actually, I'm sure that you have come across institutions who are partially or fully resistant to participate, such stakeholders as well. Say, for example, often the institutions like some of these stakeholders, supply chain managers, they are not adequately prepared to respond to situations. So they would wait for other primary stakeholders to get, say, for example, the roads done, the other lifeline services are done, and they would think that, okay, after that I can ensure that I do the supply chain and I bring in the essential goods to the places. Now, how did you, if you have met such resistant stakeholders, how have you worked with them? How have you brought them on board?
I think probably for us, Cumbria Local Resilience Forum provides the way to make that happen. So it brings all those stakeholders together in the same room, either a virtual room or a real room, to work out what the area's priorities are, rather than the priorities of an individual organisation. So those strategic coordinating group meetings that happen in an incident are generally chaired by a senior police officer for us. It's a consensus-based process, but I guess it does provide a bit of pressure on those partners who might be a bit more reluctant to understand what their role in it is. Does that help at all? I don't think it's something I've come across hugely, but I guess that is because Cumbria has had more major incidents than we care to remember, and people are probably relatively well practiced in pulling it all together.
Yeah, I think Cumbria has been really welcoming and open to basically involve every organisation in every area that they need to cover for the LRF. There's many a time that from a mountain rescue perspective said, guess guys, we don't need to be involved with this part of it, but to be invited to start with is the important part for me. Like we said before, it's about saying no as well as yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for your question. If Maddie Adams is willing to ask a question, otherwise we also have then Chris Scott with a hand up. So is Maddie there?
I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Hi, Maddie. Yes, we can.
Hi, yeah. Sorry, not
Go
used
ahead.
to using Zoom rather than Teams and different instructions. So yeah, my question really was about evaluating community resilience, especially when you're looking to prioritise resources, whether you're doing that at a multi-agency group or individual agencies. And we often look at things like, you talked about, Carolyn, is there an emergency plan? Is there a resilience group and so on? But you talked about the example of the community where they had the resilience through their campaigning they've done with the NHS and so on. So have you got any thoughts about better ways for us to evaluate resilience to target our resources, something that's a bit deeper than sort of something quite so numerical?
I think that's another of the really good questions we haven't got to the bottom of yet, Maddie. So I think as far as we've got is thinking through, there are probably a number of things we would want to make an assessment of, some of which would probably be what kind of risks that community face, of which flood risk is the easiest to kind of do on a yes-no sort of basis. And then, have they got an emergency plan? I think I suppose what we're thinking is there was a piece of work probably, or maybe 10 years ago now, done by Carnegie Trust around a concept called the Resilience Star that measured a community's resilience on 4 different axes. I think we're probably looking at doing something with some slightly different axes and maybe a few more, where you might score a community on each of those. So for the kind of, have they got an emergency plan, you'd probably score highest for having a written emergency plan that has been exercised recently. But kind of at the lower scoring, you might have had, we know that communities sat down and talked about how it would respond in an emergency, even if they've not written it down. But it's still at the stage of, it's always going to be pretty subjective, and it's going to be very hard to do that for every community. It's kind of on my to-do list over the next year as we try and get the work plan in place for the National Resilience Standard.
Excellent, thank you. I look forward to seeing anything that comes out of that.
But we look forward to having some input from others on that particular bit, I think.
Excellent, thank you.
Well, thank you, Maddie. So Chris Scott has a hand up, and then after Chris, I have a question which I think really speaks to that emergency planning meeting community development slide earlier on. So, but go ahead, Chris, first of all.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you again to Carolyn and Mike. It is a question perhaps primarily for Mike. He mentioned earlier in the presentation about RD mapping, which obviously is is a good tool that we use down here. I was just interested with regard to that membership. Are you, as that Mountain Search and Rescue, got like RD Lite registrations, or is it full RD membership? I was just intrigued because we are slightly challenged down here as to how our voluntary sector engage on that platform with shared materials.
Yeah, good question, Chris. So certainly in Cumbria, Mountain Rescue has been involved with and had full-blown RD right, very much from our first involvement, I guess, from the start of RD back in 2009 and even earlier. So the answer to your question is, we've had full-blown RD, and we certainly had a lot of full involvement and, I guess, influence on how RD mapping was developed. The answer now, Chris, is that we're all currently being moved over onto RD Lite. From regards to RD, I don't see there's any issues with that. And because of the support we've got in Cumbria, I'm expecting that will be very smooth and transitionless. Where it's a case of let's wait and see is how that affects the access onto RD with regards to RD mapping. But it's a case of if it doesn't work, then we will say something and we will make it work, because it is very much from a situational intelligence point of view. It's the preferred forum that we would like to, the preferred media that we would like to work in. We do work in pictures and maps. That helps us understand things and translate the understanding to partner organisations. So yeah, watch this space, I think, is the answer, Chris. But RD Lite.
And Andrew, Karen, who's got her hand up, is one of our civil contingency staff, so might well be able to add a little bit to the RD Lite.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. I was just going to say, yes, we're just in the process of transferring Mountain Rescue across onto Cumbria Constabulary RD Lite accounts. Now, as far as I'm aware, and we haven't done it fully yet, but as far as I'm aware, you hopefully will get an RD mapping account, or if you don't, we'll make sure that you do. However, you don't always qualify for an RD mapping account when you transfer across onto RD Lite or you become an RD Lite user. But if you do need that requirement, then it's best to get the admin person for RD, for whoever's sponsoring you as an RD Lite account holder, get them to get in touch with Resilience Direct, and hopefully they'll allow that for you.
So I think, yeah, Karen's just given us, Chris, the fantastic demonstration of make friends before you need them. She's obviously quietly sorting it for us in the background.
I'm hoping to.
Yeah, I might just follow that up with an email, if I may. Perhaps, Karen, that would be...
Yeah, you've got the support email, so just send it through on there.
That's fantastic. And Chris, you've
really helpful for us down here. That would be brilliant.
Thanks very much, and thanks for sorting that live. So just obviously conscious of time, but we have a final question, and rather than me posing it, Joan McCaffrey, who also referenced it in the chat function, is going to pose a question in relation to the emergency planning meeting community development, and this will be our final question before I hand over again to Duncan to close the webinar. So Joan, can you hear me?
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you very much to our presenters. It was an excellent presentation, and also a lot of similarities with Northern Ireland and the terrain and the different risks that we face as well. So was also very interested in about the evaluation piece and the resilience star piece. So I may come back separately as well, but just that conversation about how we link together the emergency planning piece and the community development piece, and sometimes, you know, the kind of conflicts and different agendas that those different functions have within within organizations. So just maybe a wee bit more of understanding of how you achieve that, and maybe some of the challenges that was presented, but also some of the opportunities.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess that's probably one for me, is it, Mike?
Yeah, I think so. In the fact that, for me, I think the answer is going to be that we learned how to get on with each other's in the response phase, and then we took that learning into recovery phase. But we'll see what Carolyn comes as an answer.
And I think that's, yeah, probably a fair answer for in terms of getting the LRF to work with Mountain Rescue, who are very much a grassroots community group, but also quite an organised grassroots community group. In terms of how we did that for working with really new, really tiny community groups, I guess I tended to try and take a coaching role to it. So in the year I was doing the job before COVID, I tried to sit in the background. I tried not to take over. And when we had things like Beast from the East, I went into fire headquarters. The County Council's community development team had already been pulled in to support with a lot of the phone calls on that. And I sat there with them, not taking over that function, but making sure that they got onto RD, they found the community emergency plan, they found the parish council contact details and left them to do the phoning through. And the other thing I got really involved in was kind of, I'm not sure I should say this with Karen on the call, infiltrating the statutory sector organisations. So in terms of that kind of strategic support, that was there with the police, and I spent some time working in the civil contingencies unit, just sitting there working alongside staff and having those informal conversations about how you could do things differently or where the wiggle room was. And very much the same with our county council. I spent the year before COVID, and this was an incredibly useful piece of preparation for a pandemic, working on a county council transformation programme called Thriving Communities, which was being led by our Director of Public Health. So again, I was very much in there, sitting alongside staff, helping them think through how they could work differently, and then working with our Director of Public Health to try and take away some of the barriers that were there that were stopping people from working in that kind of way. But that was the kind of the make friends, do some of the groundwork, and then have the ability and the confidence that we really could push it forward in the pandemic when there was an opportunity, and do it in an incident. I think that's back to your point, isn't it, Mike? Yeah. We wouldn't have been able to take those risks in an incident without doing a lot of that background work beforehand. So I think that is probably
and for just making the friends, I suppose, and having those contacts, and just that everyone's agenda really is the same, as really putting your people first, but just making sure everybody understands that. So yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for all of your questions. Hopefully we've answered most of them, and just to pass over to Duncan.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you, Caroline and Mike. It's a great presentation. You've really made us think about all the work you're doing in Cumbria, which we already knew was fantastic, but it just helps to bring it to life, and gives us more food for thought in terms of, well, what should we be doing differently in different parts of the UK? What lessons can we take? And part of the sharing of good experiences from across the UK is really meant to help prompt different people to think in different ways. And you've really done that in a whole range of different ways for me today. So thank you very much indeed. In terms of the next webinar, so you've heard from Chris Scott, you've heard from Martin Funnell today. They've come off mute and asked some questions. And it's their turn next time on the 6th of December, where they're going to be talking about some of the work they've been doing in West Sussex around a campaign called What If You Can Make a Difference? And this is a really interesting approach that they've been working on for the last 10 years or so. And they'll be talking about their experiences from that. I guess another shout out for the conference. We're running a national conference of societal resilience in Manchester, 21st of March. You're all welcome. Check out the NCSR webpage for that. And lastly, thanks to Andrew for coordinating Q&As so well. So thank you very much indeed, everybody. As Andrew said, the video will be on YouTube. We'll make that available in the next few days. And please join the LinkedIn so you can get further updates of either the video or from the webinar or the conference. And thank you all for joining and for your questions and for making this a very interactive session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much, everyone, from us.
Thank you.
Fantastic questions that have got us thinking too.